Let me just go through all the scopes that I own. Might be the easiest way. So I still have the first telescope that I bought, which is a C8 Newtonian, which is for visual only. It's basically the tube is just too long. It'll actually have to be modified and cut down if I ever wanted to use it for imaging, which I probably never will because it's a great scope for just doing visual. Then I have its bigger brother, which is a 12-inch Newtonian. That thing's big. So I use that every now and then when scene conditions allow it. And then I have the Explr 100 and the Explr 150, and then lots of little smaller refractors and things like that. Most of them are like guide scopes and, nothing spectacular.
Got
So
it.
those are the main things that I currently use. You know what, the funny thing here is I always say the same thing for absolute beginners. Start with a DSLR camera of some description. Do not go out there and buy one. Try to find something that you currently own and start from there. So it doesn't matter what you got, a Nikon, a Canon, a Sony, a Fuji, whatever. Any of those cameras will always work. So as a starting point, that's where I would always tell people to look into it. Because what happens here is if you decide to throw your money into, say, a telescope, like a refractor, 100 millimeters or something like that, something somewhat affordable, like you blow, I don't know, £600-700 into the whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
The problem here is it's the learning curve that you now have to experience, and we haven't even gone into the software yet. And then you have to think about, well, what kind of camera am I going to use? Do I go monochrome? Do I go one-shot color? If I go monochrome, I'd have to do filters. So now I have to have some kind of a control platform. Namely, I have to bring a laptop out. So you can see this whole thing can snowball and get very complicated very quickly. So my advice to most people who have never picked anything up before and want to get into it the way I kind of got into it is start with a camera and a tripod and start with Milky Way photography first to see if you get into it. If you get to that point and you just want more out of it and you want to get longer and longer focal lengths, so loosely translated in the world of cameras, it's longer lenses. So you want to go anything above 85 millimeters is considered long telephoto, 135 millimeters, 200, etc., etc. At that point, do you look into buying a platform of some description? One of the best starting points, and anything that you buy, by the way, even in the future, is not useless. You don't just throw this stuff away. It's always useful. Take a look at something called the Star Adventurer from Skywatcher. And for those of you who are obviously listening in Europe or the UK, Skywatcher, I think everybody and their mother knows who Skywatcher is. So check out the Star Adventurer Pro. That will be a really good starting point. Mount that onto the camera and off you go. Now, once you're ready to upgrade, and let's just say you get that interest, here's a common mistake that everybody makes, because I used to work in retail selling telescopes. So they'll run out, they'll buy a 11-inch SCT of some description, and the most amount they can possibly afford, and they'll spend on average £3,000 to £4,000. US wise, that's about $4,000 or $5,000, give or take. And they always struggle. They find it very, very difficult to operate these things. They can't seem to get past the alignment procedure, and it's just such a turnoff because there's such a big learning curve. So the company Celestron here in the US, they also exist in Europe as well, but nowhere near as big as Skywatcher. They have a small mount called the AVX mount. This mount has just recently gone through a refresh, so they kind of like updated it a little bit and added little extras, bells and whistles. So something like that is a great starting point, but what you have to do is learn the sky. It's the alignment procedure, and the polar alignment is the part that trips you over. Now remember, we're still using DSLR mirrorless cameras here. We haven't gotten into using anything else. And I stress that quite specifically, purely because you're trying to learn too many things at once. And that's the overwhelming part behind it. So now let's move into the intermediate group of people. So you've gone past that phase, you bought your telescope, you know how to use it, you can make this thing fly around in circles and do funny things, and you've got some half decent shots. So now we're going to up our game and increase our exposure time and our focal length. So we're now going to run across another interesting problem with these tracking mounts. They're not necessarily, sorry, my cat decided to join. They're not necessarily going to be 100% accurate. So what you now need to get into is something called guiding. So this is where having some kind of control device becomes critical. So you have to bring out like a laptop or one of these Intel NUCs or a Raspberry Pi of some description. There's a company called ZWO that sells a lot of products. They're based out in China. They sell pretty much all over the world. They created something called the ASI Air, which is basically a small Raspberry Pi machine which will control most popular mounts out there, as well as some of their cameras. So not all cameras work on this. A lot of the times it's all the ZWO ASI based cameras would work. So with one of these boxes, you now get introduced to something called guiding. And most commonly people do guiding with a guide scope. So there's a second scope that's attached to the existing scope, either through accessory dovetail clamps, that kind of stuff. And what this thing does is it has the same field of view as what you're currently looking at, and it looks at a star, and if it notices it starts to drift, it'll send pulse commands to the mount to correct, to go back the other direction or slow down, is what it really is. It doesn't actually make it go the opposite direction. It's actually a big misconception. It actually just slows the motor down. And in some cases, the declination, if you're in an equatorial mount, it'll also correct for that too, if your polar alignment is off.